This is lecture 8, and this lecture is about globalization and migration. So one place to start, as your book does, is just trying to figure out what we even mean by globalization. It's a word that gets tossed around quite a bit, and it's not always used in the same ways. The ways that anthropologists use the term globalization is to talk about an increase in the interconnectedness of people, places, things, and ideas across the world regions. Okay, your book references a definition offered by a scholar named Steger, who's done a lot of work on the subject, and what he says is that globalization is the intensification of worldwide social relations which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. So there again, that idea of interconnectedness. The other thing I want to point out about this definition, and indeed about the ways that anthropologists talk about globalization, is that it's simultaneously about economic relationships, but also about social and cultural relationships. So it's really sort of a multifaceted phenomenon. One of the other issues that is often raised in discussions about globalization is how to put a sort of historical frame on it. We tend to talk about globalization as if it's brand new, and I think many would agree that the pace of globalization has speeded up over time. So the sort of contemporary era, we see a much more rapid and much more sort of profound interconnectedness of the world. But if we look back historically, we can see that some of the antecedents, some of the sort of sources of this much more, again, sort of rapid process of globalization now actually stretch back quite a ways. And different scholars push that historical timeline back to varying degrees. So I wanted to talk now just a little bit about some of those historical antecedents to contemporary globalization, just to demonstrate that although there is something distinctive about the modern era, it's not without precedent, right? That in fact, the things that have led to the processes that we recognize today as globalization have been going on for a very long time. So we really want to go way back. We can start in the prehistoric period and point out just that people have been on the move for a very long time, since the beginning of our species, really. Starting in this prehistoric period, from 10,000 to 3,500 BCE, we see migrations and the development of particular technologies that had a profound effect both on human history and on, again, this sort of evolution towards something we recognize as globalization. Most notably, the development of agriculture, which affected not only things like how people eat, but also how people are organized into societies. And also started processes such as trade, which we definitely recognize as a part of globalization. During the pre-modern period, so from 3500 BCE to 1500 CE, we see some key developments, particularly in technologies, writing, and the invention of the wheel, both of which made long-distance travel or longer-distance travel and communication possibilities. So we see during this period also the development of long-distance trade routes. So, for example, the Silk Road, where goods were conveyed across really large distances. And this is important because, again, this is not only an economic but also a sociocultural process. So as those goods move, they also influence things like people's tastes, right? What people eat or what people value. So again, these are processes that look very similar to the contemporary forms that we call globalization. Part of this development of long-distance trade also informed the rise of certain kinds of socio-political units. So we have entities that we would recognize as large empires. The one pictured here, Great Zimbabwe, which was in existence from around 1200 to 1500. In the ruins of Great Zimbabwe are the remnants of all kinds of long-distance trade goods. Porcelain from China, copper coins from other parts of the African continent, etc. So we know that these empires, in addition to the sort of political strength that they had locally, were also enmeshed in global economic systems. The early modern period from 1500 to 1750, which your book also mentioned, is certainly a clear antecedent to contemporary globalization. This is during the period when the European countries traveled the world and established themselves as colonial powers by claiming territories in various parts on various parts of the globe. So we really see more of this connection as, again, these colonial empires connected different parts of the world economically, politically, and socially. The modern period, so starting at around 1750 and into the sort of middle, late 20th century, we see further change, particularly the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which led to the rise of new kinds of workspaces like factories, which also, again, transformed the production of goods, the consumption of goods, and certainly the way that goods were sort of distributed through various trading channels. Your book also mentions a particular moment in 20th century history, which is the Bretton Woods Conference and the various other developments after World War II that established international organizations that in the period since then have had a tremendous effect on the world and on this, again, increasing interconnection. So entities like the IMF and World Bank, which have had a tremendous effect on international economics, and the UN, which has established all kinds of international political treaties and agreements among or across world regions and nation states. All of these developments are really about these broader entities, broader organizations that supersede individual societies or individual states. And all of those are hallmarks of globalization. In terms of how we theorize globalization within anthropology, your book mentions a particular piece of scholarship by the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, who has been very influential in anthropology and in other social sciences for the particular sort of theoretical model that he uses to understand globalization. And that model is, Appadurai talks about scapes. Scapes are a way of understanding how different sorts of things move around the world, how they flow around the world. And Appadurai has recognized several of these scapes. So again, this is just a way of thinking about that interconnectedness by tracing the movements of different kinds of things. So one of the first ones that Appadurai talks about is what he refers to as ethnoscapes. So this is the movement of people, of populations of people. Migration is also a part of the unit that we're working on this week. Indeed, the sort of movement of populations of people is absolutely one of the most important elements of globalization. You're reading a book about just such a thing right now, the Labor and Legality book. And the lives of the lions depicted in that book are very much an example of this sort of modern globalization and the human movement that accompanies it. Again, this is not a brand new phenomenon. We can look, for example, to the early 20th century in the United States as a time of tremendous immigration into the U.S., particularly from Europe, through the present, right? Our borders have, in some ways, become much more politicized than they were at the turn of the 20th century. But all the same, this movement of people in particular directions, very much a part of globalization. And this is the element of globalization that Apatarai refers to as ethnoscapes. Another one of these scapes is what Apatarai calls technoscapes. So if ethnoscapes are the movement of people, technoscapes is the movement of technology. And again, we can see the ways in which certain technologies and the places that they sort of take hold and the effects that they have in the societies where they take hold are very important to the sort of contemporary world. So one that I chose to pull out here, just because I think it's an interesting example, is that of cell phones. In the U.S., many of us sort of have taken for granted that we have a cell phone on us at most times of the day. But the fact is the distribution of these kinds of technologies is really uneven. And there are some sort of surprising ways in which technology is distributed. So, for example, although we think of the cell phone as a sort of largely Western phenomenon, the fact is that the majority of cell phone users live in the developing world. And if you look, in fact, at the adoption of cell phones on the African continent, you see incredible growth. So even as the vast majority of people in Africa do not have landlines, there's this incredible increase over recent years of people with cell phones. So there was sort of, although in the U.S. many households started with landlines and moved from there to cell phones, on the African continent, many people sort of leapfrogged over the landline directly to the cell phone. And that's had a huge effect on both the ability of people to stay in touch with other people and across even diasporic communities, as it affords people the ability to stay in touch with other family members and friends who have migrated to other parts of the world. Finance-scapes are another one of the scapes. We know that money is mobile in the contemporary world, that in fact it often exists in a completely electronic or virtual form as it moves across various kinds of banking and investment organizations. So one of the things that Apatarai noticed is that one of the things that's absolutely flowing around the world are finances. Mediascapes is another one where one of the facts of globalization is that various media forms are not limited to a particular locale, that in fact, particularly now via the internet and other kinds of communication forms, television shows, movies, music, any kind of media can transgress all of those boundaries. So there's a lot greater sort of proliferation as these media forms travel the globe. One example I pulled out is the case of the popularity of the TV show Columbo in Japan. You guys may be, or maybe you're too young to remember Columbo, which was a sort of detective show back in the 1970s, which interestingly has become a very popular show in Japan. So this is again just an example of media forms crossing national and cultural boundaries via mediascapes. Idioscapes are another one of Apatarai's scapes. This is the movement of ideologies. So we can certainly talk about political ideologies as crossing boundaries. Your book talks, for example, about neoliberalism as one sort of ideology that has had a tremendous effect on world society. And one of the ways that it has done so is by being sort of exported from the West to various other countries and becoming a sort of dominant ideology in that way. Now, as these kinds of movements and intersections take place, one of the key things that anthropologists like to point out is that it doesn't mean that local culture gets destroyed. Often we even hear this phrase, the McDonaldization of the world, which is usually used to suggest that because we have these sort of global commodities and these global cultural flows, that stuff coming from the West, and particularly stuff coming from the US, sort of steamrolls over everything else, so everything becomes more the same. Anthropologists would suggest that that's not actually the case. It is certainly true that commodities, including stuff like fast food from McDonald's, certainly have spread all over the place, but it doesn't mean that they're exactly the same everywhere. So, in fact, what often happens when there are sort of global, either cultural items or items for consumption that move from one place to another, where they are received, they take on some of the local flavor. And that process is sometimes referred to as globalization. So in other words, it's between the global and the local. So it's the ways in which the global and the local connect. So we can even look at something that seems as sort of familiar as McDonald's and see that it's not actually the same everywhere, right? McDonald's is an international corporation that certainly has its fingers all over the place, right? It's in contact with all countries in the world for the most part, but it still is connected to local tastes to some extent. So if you look at the menu items at McDonald's restaurants in different countries, you'll find that in fact they are different. They reflect what people in that place want to eat, for example. You'll also find, if you look, there's actually quite a bit of research on McDonald's. You also find that if you look at that research, that the meanings of McDonald's are also really variable. So in the U.S., we tend to think of McDonald's and fast food more generally as very casual, right? But in plenty of places, McDonald's is a sort of status symbol, and it's something that's considered sort of a high status place to go or to be seen. So it really depends on the social context. And again, we find lots of things in today's world that are at that intersection of global and local. Speaking of consumption, consumption is another key topic in the anthropology of globalization. The things that people buy often have a lot to do with things other than just the object itself. That they reflect questions of taste, what people prefer, and they also confer identity and status. And this is certainly the case with global commodities that people consume. That certain kinds of brand names often are seen as reflecting something about the owner. And people therefore go to great lengths sometimes to get a hold of those things. One example is sushi tuna, and I use this as an example because of the incredibly globalized nature of this particular item for consumption. So some sushi tuna, some of the best sushi tuna, in fact, is caught off the waters of Massachusetts. But it is often still routed through the major sushi tuna brokers who are located in Japan. And there's a famous fish market in Tokyo where much of the sushi grade tuna passes through on its way elsewhere. So you can start to imagine that a high status item like this sort of very fine kind of sushi tuna can make a sort of global journey from where it is caught in the Atlantic Ocean to where it is brokered in Tokyo, Japan, to where it ends up on your table, right? So this, in fact, is a picture from a local restaurant here in Chicago. So when you eat sushi, you may, in fact, be eating an extremely sort of globalized commodity that has gone all the way around the world just to get to that plate. So when anthropologists think about globalization, for the most part, the interest is in understanding the processes and understanding how globalization operates in the world. But we can also think about how those processes of globalization affect people. And I think it's fair to say that there are both some sort of what we would generally think of as positive effects and some of what we would generally think of as negative effects, as your book points out. So it is true that there are all kinds of things that people are able to access by virtue of globalization that they wouldn't have been able to in the past. So things like technologies that allow you to stay in touch with other people, to communicate across boundaries and across huge spaces, access to information, receiving aid, right? Even humanitarian aid across boundaries and across world regions. All of those kinds of connections really do have the possibility of increasing people's well-being. But there are lots of negative things attached to globalization as well. It's not simply the case that globalization sort of brings more good things into everyone's lives, because globalization still happens in a context of global inequity. And indeed, there's a certain amount, even maybe particularly in recent years, of backlash against globalization. So one of the sort of byproducts of globalization is xenophobia. That is, people reacting against the flows of people and cultural items and ideas that are crossing boundaries, and reacting by saying, no, let's shore up those boundaries, right? Let's keep people out, let's secure our borders, etc. So that is a sort of negative byproduct, but it certainly is part of the story of globalization. We could certainly point to much more specific things as negative effects of globalization. I think you could very well say that the COVID pandemic byproduct of globalization, right? It's about international travel and the sort of porousness of borders right now. So the incredible amount of suffering and loss that's been a result of that pandemic and the many other pandemics that have happened again across history, we can certainly say that that is one effect of globalization, and one that is certainly negative for people who encounter it. We could also suggest that a sort of another sort of negative element of globalization is that it has not really disrupted the long-standing relationships between the global North and the global South. Indeed, many have noted that the colonial relationships that we talked about earlier in the lecture have been continued through the process of globalization. So your book, for example, talks about how the IMF, in particularly the 1980s and 1990s, enacted across the global South these programs of structural adjustment, which were programs where basically the global South became deeply and ever further indebted to this banking institution, the IMF, and that indebtedness was used as leverage to force people to adopt certain kinds of economic and political principles that were beneficial to the global North. So, in other words, that exactly the relationships that were established during the colonial era were extended and, in fact, some ways deepened in the contemporary era or the recent past. So, indeed, globalization in some ways has not been about breaking boundaries. In some ways, it's just been about maintaining some of those relationships that were deeply unequal to begin with. The final point I'll make about globalization is all of this sort of interconnectedness and recognizing that interconnectedness has also had an effect on how anthropologists do their research. As you've been learning this semester, anthropologists do field research typically by locating themselves in a particular place, in a community, and trying to learn as deeply as they can about life in that community. Well, as we've just been talking about, often that community is connected in all kinds of ways to lots of other communities in different parts of the world. And anthropologists, therefore, have had to shift some of their methods over time. One of the ways is by doing what's sometimes referred to as multi-sited ethnography. So still using some of those same techniques of doing interviews and observations and all those other kinds of things we've talked about, but maybe doing it in several different locations, right? To try to get a sense of how different places are connected as part of a network, right? So not assuming that each community is sort of separate unto itself, but trying to bridge between one place and another by doing some research in one part of the network and some research in another part of the network. So that's one way in which anthropology has changed. And the other is that it has encouraged anthropologists to expand some of the topics that we study, right? In earlier parts of the history of anthropology, anthropologists tended to, for example, work in more rural spaces, rural communities. Now anthropologists work everywhere in the world, including, in the center of big cities, right? Or working on various kinds of power brokers. So indeed, anthropologists understand that it's important that the research that we do also demonstrates those connections between the global north and the global south, and precisely those power dynamics that are that unequally distribute power across the world. So I don't think anyone would say that anthropologists have stopped doing the kind of research that has long been a part of the field, but more that we have added on some other techniques for doing research and some other topics that are increasingly important in the wake of globalization. So we'll stop the lecture there, and I hope you have a great rest of the week.